Hello, my name is Allison Casillas, and I'm a pastor here at the Arlington Adventist Church. We're excited today because we're joined by Michal Anne Whitcomb, who is a counselor at the Dallas Counseling Group, today for a little bit of a conversation about depression. So for those who don't know you, Michal Anne, what is kind of your background? Can you tell us a little bit about your practice?
Sure. I have a master's in counseling psychology, and I have I am a licensed professional counselor. And so I have a private practice in Dallas, like you said, Dallas Counseling Group, and I work with 3 other mental health professionals there, and we focus on a wide variety of issues, but work with families, individuals, and children on issues of anxiety, depression, relational issues, marriage. The list kind of goes on there.
So I think everyone has heard the term depression, and whether or not we have like a real background in it, I think everyone has probably kind of created their own definition in their mind of what depression is, whether that's from media or television or personal experience. But from a clinical standpoint, what would you say might be a good working definition of depression?
Mm-hmm. So depression is a syndrome, meaning it's a combination of symptoms that occur at the same time. Those symptoms are obviously a big part of that is going to be a low mood or a depressed mood, or what we might describe as sadness over a period of time. It's going to be characterized by a loss of interest, a lack of interest, or kind of a lack of motivation. And then sometimes changes in weight, eating patterns, things of that nature. And then it's kind of a combination of at least 5 other symptoms. We said depressed mood. It can look like sleep disturbances. It can vary from person to person, but there's a variety of symptoms that if they've occurred at the same time for over a period of 2 weeks, then that's when a person would get an official diagnosis of depression.
Okay. So it can look different in some ways for different people then?
Yeah, it can be a range of symptoms for different people.
Okay. So if you think that you might have depression, mm-hmm. What are some things that you can do? Are you just stuck with it? Is this the way life is from this point? Or are there things that you can do?
Right. Depression is very treatable, and there's different ways to approach it. Obviously, if you've experienced those symptoms, it's very helpful to work with a mental health professional or a doctor of some sort who would be able to help you to look through those symptoms, identify them, and diagnose it. And with that, then there are a variety of options for treatment. Now, the research base, it shows us that the treatment options with the best efficacy are going to be a combination of medication and therapy of some sort. Now, does that mean that anyone with that diagnosis of depression needs to be on medication? No, and that's why it's important to be working with a mental health professional or with a doctor to start taking a look at what's going on specifically for you, and then setting out kind of a treatment course. But to answer your question of, what can you do? So one thing I would say, like I said previously, is seek help. Start talking about this and get information for yourself to take a look at what it is that you're experiencing. There are a lot of ways that we can change our behaviors and that we can start addressing the symptoms that we're experiencing in practice and through coping skills. So that can look like, in working with clients, very often we focus on our thinking patterns. Mm-hmm. So depression, one of the symptoms of depression is going to be characterized by feelings of worthlessness, feelings of shame. And so it can be really helpful to take a look at what are your thinking patterns, what are the thought processes that are going on, and start to recognize a pattern in those, and then start to look at confronting them. Identifying kind of the lies of depression, and then finding what are ways that I can ground myself in what I know to be true and reason to start challenging some of the lies and some of those feelings of worthlessness that come. Also, behaviors such as exercise, that's incredibly helpful. Sometimes that's actually one form of treatment for depression, is focusing solely on physical exercise and activity. So being intentional about getting outside a couple, or in a gym or whatever that looks like, 2 or 3 times a week, and becoming physically active, that has a huge impact on the mood that we experience. Along with that, being outside in the sunshine, just starting to look at very simple behavioral things like that can start to make a difference in the way that we feel. So looking at our thoughts, and then also changing some of our behaviors. A really good question that I encourage clients to ask themselves at times is, what would I be doing if I weren't feeling this way, if I weren't depressed? What would be the activities and things that I would engage in? Mm-hmm. And then start looking at maybe 1 or 2 of those things that you can start to reintroduce into your experience, into your activities.
You mentioned the term coping skills. Can you talk a little bit about that? What would be some coping skills, and what are coping skills?
Mm-hmm. Well, coping skills are the things that the approaches that we use to handle challenges or difficult experiences in our lives, to deal with hard things. And I kind of went over some of those coping skills. Exercise is a great coping skill. Reaching out for support. Depression isolates us. It often kind of tells us, like I said, those messages of worthlessness are very common in depression. And along with that, it tells us that I'm a burden to others and people don't like me, people don't enjoy me. And so then that causes us to want to isolate, to want to kind of pull back from relationships. So an important coping skill would be make sure that you're spending time with others, that you are reaching out to supportive relationships, even if depression is telling you isolate, withdraw. Okay. And the list can go on, right? But I like to look at coping skills kind of among the categories of looking at taking care of your physical self. So coping skills that are going to be focused on nurturing your body, exercise, rest, relaxation, all of those things would fall in that physical category. But then we also look at coping skills that have more to do with social engagement. So who am I engaging with? Who am I spending time with? Coping skills that focus more on our spiritual lives, and how are ways that I feel connected to God and that I can make sense of my life and my situation. And then coping skills that focus on the mind, that focus on what are my thoughts telling me, how can I recognize thoughts that are unproductive for me, and then start to replace them with something else.
I think the recognition that just because we're Christian doesn't mean that we're exempt from experiencing things like depression and anxiety. And you see evidence of that in the Bible, actually. Anyone who's read all the way through the Psalms sees that in particular in David. He's very high one minute, and then he's asking God to rescue his life from the pit the next. And so I do think that it's important to understand that just because you're having these feelings, and maybe it's kind of a pervasive state for you, it does not mean that you've been abandoned by God or that you are not a good Christian. This is something that God understands about us, and he understands that that's part of kind of the cycles of life at times, and he speaks to it. He speaks to it powerfully in Scripture. Yeah. So that, for me, I think that might be another coping skill. Just Scripture and connectivity with your community of faith, and looking at what the Bible does say about some of these things. But that is to be used in conjunction with some of these other things. You can't focus on one to the exclusion of the others.
Yeah, definitely. The balance and your approach to dealing with depression can be incredibly helpful, and it's very important. And in the psychological world, lots of time there hasn't been a lot of congruency with the spirituality part of mental health, and sometimes just choosing to avoid or to not even pay attention to that in the profession has not been helpful. So as that has started to shift, and there's been kind of an acknowledgement on both sides,
Right.
Both from the faith world and acknowledging, yeah, this is a part of a person's walk. It's sometimes going through those dark periods, and mental health side, recognizing this is a huge, important part of mental health.
Right.
It works well together.
It really does. So you mentioned being connected with other people as a potential coping skill. What advice would you give to those who maybe don't experience depression, who do have someone in their life who does, and they're trying to reach out or just know what is helpful and what is not?
Sure. I think for someone who has not experienced depression, seeing someone that you love or someone that you care about go through depression, it can be really frustrating and very confusing, very difficult to understand at times. Because, so often the feeling is, well, just stop feeling that way and start,
Right.
just start changing your behaviors, right?
Right.
And so that's a very understandable experience for someone on the outside looking in.
Kind of profoundly unhelpful for the one who's actually experiencing
really
the depression.
Yeah, and it can feed into, like I said, the feelings of worthlessness and shame are a big part of depression, and it can feed into sometimes those messages that say I'm a burden to others, and that I'm just causing problems for those around me. People don't really want to be around me. So I would say number one thing is patience. To approach them with patience and understanding, and being willing to kind of give the time and the space for a person to sort through what's going on with them and to get on a track that starts to lead them toward recovery. I think too, if you approach a person who's going through a depressive period, you really don't have to approach them with knowledge, right, of knowing exactly what's going on and this is what we need to do, but approach them with an attitude of listening to understand. Help me to understand what this is like for you. Help me to get a picture of what's the hardest for you right now, and then how can I be of any help for you. So that approach of listening to understand, I think, helps to disarm the other person, and helps to kind of quiet down those messages of shame and that there's something wrong with me and that I'm not understandable. The other thing is that, like we said before, depression isolates us. It tells us to withdraw. And so the more that you can be available to that person, be persistent in making connection, giving opportunity to say, there are times where I'm here to listen to you and we can talk, but also times if you just need to be with someone, come be with me, or I'll come be with you. I'm willing to sit with you in this place, even if it's hard and even if I'm not actively working to fix it for you, I'll be with you.
Okay. I'm curious as to what you think the impact of this, the pandemic that we're currently going through has had on people who experience depression. Is there an uptick in it? And then also, what does that do to trying to use coping skills, particularly those related to the social aspect?
Yeah.
And even being outside, I think some places they're not even allowed outside more than once a day.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that with my clients and the work that I'm doing, my clients and I have seen initially quite a bit of anxiety that presented with individuals. Obviously it was an anxiety provoking time.
Right.
And now over kind of a period of time, I'm seeing with clients maybe more depressive symptoms that are becoming louder. The reality is that anxiety and depression are kind of buddies and they often present together. Okay. But it seems like over time, and like you said, with more distancing, the more time that we spend out of our routines, the more time that we may be under persistent stress from finances, and just the uncertainties and the difficulties that come with this period of time. I think that those factors really contribute to and feed into maybe to depressive symptoms. And I imagine that we may see some lasting impact from that, as obviously there are going to be lasting consequences of this when it comes to people's financial situations, to to a variety of factors.
Lots of loss,
yes,
associated with this.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, is that with so many people in this situation, they're grieving a great deal of things, whether that's financial security, or whether that's graduation, or for a lot of my clients that are kind of in their 20s, they were right here at this verge of graduating and starting their lives. And now they're looking at this with even more uncertainty of, how do I start a career in this climate? And what is that going to look like for me? So there are a lot of things that people are grieving. And so all of those things I anticipate may have some lasting impact on people and their mental health.
Okay. How would you suggest helping if you have a friend who is experiencing depression and you can't physically be with them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that one, just being intentional and reaching out to them, making phone calls, texting, Zoom, and I think we're all sick of Zoom at this point in our lives, but it still is a great way to connect, FaceTime, whatever, just ways to reach out and to be connected to that person. And I would be consistent in that, checking in, how are you doing? What's going on with you right now? The other thing too that I think sometimes we might overlook is the value of sharing your experiences with someone else. Because what that does is it helps to normalize our experience of this, that if I'm in a place where I'm feeling depressed and I'm having all of the things that come along with depression, and I have that voice in my head that says you're just no good and things are never going to change, hopelessness is a big part of depression, I start to feel like there's really something wrong with me. And so if I can hear from someone else, hey, I really identify with that, or, here's been my struggle lately, or this is a part of this that has been hard for me, that can really be helpful to a person to hear, I'm not the only one who has ever felt this way. And the way that this is impacting me, someone else can identify with.
For me, I'm looking at this and realizing that as a church, just like the world church, and I would say particularly Western Christianity, we tend to talk about things like depression or addiction or any struggle that someone goes through only at the end, when we can look back and say, hey, look, this is what the Lord has delivered me from. And I think there's really great power in a testimony, but there is also power in articulating the strain in the midst of the crisis. Because if you're in the middle of this and it feels like, man, I've been doing this forever and ever and ever, and I'm just not going to get the miracle like so-and-so does. If we only talk about it once it's over, and once we're looking at it as something that we've overcome and we're triumphal, I think it cripples us to a great extent, because part of life's journey is the ups and the downs, and sometimes it's just hard. Sometimes life is just hard, but the body of Christ, being together, we really, when we are honest about our experiences, is when we're the strongest and when we help each other the most. Right. When we're all pretending that everything is okay and we're doing this all separately in different places, and put a shout out every time something good happens. It's an unrealistic picture of a Christian walk. Yeah. And so I would hope that a part of the process here is just coming to talk about depression and anxiety and addictions and marital issues, any kind of struggle that comes with life, as being a part of the Christian walk, as as opposed to being something that we've overcome through the Christian walk.
Right. And I mean, what you're talking about there is vulnerability, right? And that when I share from the vantage point of being back in a solid place again, it doesn't require a great deal of vulnerability for me, right? But if we, in the midst of the dark times, of the hard times, are sharing that experience, that is a vulnerable place. But also, when we are vulnerable, that's when we're open for connection. That's when we are open to experience support. So I'm in agreement with you.
Any other things you would add to this as we kind of wrap up now?
Well, I feel like it is helpful to understand the different ways that depression can present for individuals. And, interestingly enough, that a person who maybe has gone through a period of depression, came out of that, and then experienced another depressive episode and down the road, those two bouts of depression may even present differently. That someone might experience, very different symptoms the second time as compared to the first time. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is irritability. And sometimes that one flies under the radar for individuals is to not connect irritability as a depressive symptom. That feels more like I'm just annoyed and angry. But that can be a presentation of depression, particularly among teens and children too. Because sometimes it's easier for kids and teens to connect with feelings of anger than it is with feelings of sadness.
That makes sense.
So yeah, irritability, and I mentioned feelings of hopelessness, and that is very significant. That depression is telling me that things are bad and that things are hard and they're never going to get better. Depression is episodic, and so there is a point where depression, those symptoms will heighten and then they'll come back down. Obviously, that is much more difficult, and if you haven't had it treated, you don't gain the skills that you can develop with experiencing treatment. But what that lets us know is that this will not last forever. There will become a point where I start to feel better. So hopelessness is a big part of depression. Worthlessness and the negative self-talk, and that can be something that is important to pay attention to. Is if I'm noticing I'm having kind of this lack of energy and not enjoying things as much as I usually did, I feel more sad. Is this depression? Listen for your self-talk. Are there feelings and thoughts of worthlessness? Are you really hard on yourself and kind of that inner monologue? And if so, that can be another thing that really points to depression. The last thing that I really didn't touch on was the physical manifestations of depression. And I mentioned, sleep disturbances, having trouble going to sleep. Even more common is struggling to stay asleep at night. But also, depression can make you fatigued. It can cause you even to feel just physical pain and achiness. So as I said, there's so many different ways that it can present in an individual, and it's really helpful to be able to take a look at that with someone who can kind of give you that whole picture of what those symptoms might mean.
Well, we thank you so much for your time here. I think it's been really helpful, at least to me, and I think to others as well, as we start to kind of look at honestly at the experiences of a lifetime, and the ways that we can help to connect with each other and to support each other through them. Thank you so much.